right. Hello, everyone. I'll give Zoom just a minute to finish admitting everyone from the waiting room. We are recording this event and it'll be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. So if you have to leave early or you missed something, you're welcome to go back and watch it, and I will be emailing a link to that along with a survey afterwards. We still have a few people coming in, so I'm going to really slowly talk through a little bit of Zoom etiquette. As you may have noticed, I'm sharing my screen with you all today. So if you haven't already adjusted your view so that you're using the gallery view or the active speaker view, those are what I recommend so that you can see both the shared slides and whomever is speaking. We love to see faces at these events, so please feel free to turn your video on, especially at the end. I'll stop sharing the slides and we'll open it up to questions, and it'll be more like a conversation. So please feel free to share your video at that time. You're also welcome to ask questions in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function and we'll pull you off mute. For the rest of the presentation, please do keep yourselves on mute. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to Unpacking the exhibition, Death and Dying. This is the second in our series of events in support of our winter exhibition, Fullness, a reflection on mourning, which is now on view at the GVSU Art Gallery in the Haas Center for Performing Arts on our Allendale campus. If you haven't yet seen the show, you can visit our website, which you're looking at right here. We'll drop a link to this in the chat too. On this webpage, we've actually got a virtual interactive 3D tour available. You'll see a little bit of video of that. You're also welcome to stop by the exhibition in person during regular gallery hours through Friday, April 1st. So you have a couple more weeks to see the show. And you can find the gallery location and our hours, as well as some learning resources and a really great curated reading list from university libraries on our website. And again, we'll drop a link into the chat. I also want to mention that the GVSU Art Gallery actually serves the entire campus community across all campuses. GVSU holds the second largest art collection in the state of Michigan. Artwork is thoughtfully curated into every university building, and we believe that visual art viewing experiences have the power to spark conversations, action, and reflection on core themes of social justice, human rights, and empathy that align with the university's philosophy of liberal education. So today, we are thrilled to welcome GVSU professors Anna Hammersmith and Gwyn Madden. They're here to discuss how experiences of death are defined, honored, and navigated in contemporary America and around the world and throughout history. The intent of this conversation is really twofold. It's first to put the artwork in this exhibition, which you're looking at right now, into context, and second, to use the artwork and the general themes in this exhibition as a launch pad into deeper conversations about death and dying. So before I introduce our guests, I'd like to provide some information about the show, especially for those of you that haven't yet been able to see it. So I'll share with you examples of artwork from the three artists included. All three are metalsmith artists, and we'll start with Renee Zettel-Sterling, who's also a GVSU professor here in the Visual and Media Arts Department, teaching jewelry and metalsmithing. The other two artists are Sue Amendolora and Adrian M. Grafton. Renee's work in this exhibition is the culmination of a decade's worth of reflection on the death of her brother. In her work, she utilizes her brother's clothes and precious metals alongside casts of hands and faces. The hands and faces are cast from herself and her family members and other loved ones. And these objects are meant to be wearable. There's actually some great photos in the gallery of her physically wearing the items. And they're meant to represent gestures of comfort and empathy. Sue Amendolora's work, which is what you're looking at here, reflects upon the loss of both family members and close friends over multiple years. She combines common objects like scissors, like you're looking at here, and casts in sterling silver of funeral flowers. You can kind of see them here. They blend in with the scissor handles pretty well. She combines these into objects that represent both a connection to loved ones and a desire to let go. And Adrian's work, she creates larger scale works. When you walk into the gallery, the pieces that you see first are probably going to be Adrian's. I'm still working in metals alongside other materials like wood and plaster. Her work is a reflection on the loss of her mother that she lost in 2014. And in her work, she uses concrete facts and ideas related to her relationship with her mother. So on the right-hand side here, you're looking at a piece that is made with balloons. And then in the foreground, you see this handcrafted dart. The balloons, there's 69 balloons, which represent the 69 years that her mother was alive, in the shape of a traditional funeral wreath, and the dart referencing the fragility of life. And in the ladder here, we've got 37 rungs, the age Adrian was when her mother passed away. So together, these three artists represent very personalized contemporary relationships with the process of honoring death, specifically through the eyes of fine artists. And of course, today we're going to look at the bigger picture and to learn about death from a social, cultural, global, historical perspective. So with that, I'd finally like to welcome our guests. I'll read their bios and then I'll pass it over to Anna. So Professor Hammersmith grew up north of Columbus, Ohio. She attended Denison University in Granville, Ohio, where she earned a double major in sociology, anthropology, and Spanish. In 2018, Professor Hammersmith graduated with a PhD in sociology and a minor in quantitative methods from Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Her areas of specialization are aging and families, parents' relationships with their adult children, and caregiving, as well as union dissolution and formation in later life. Professor Madden received her PhD from University of Nevada. She's a bioarchaeologist with specialty in osteology, paleopathology, and mummy research. Her current research focuses on excavation in Ukraine, analysis of Byzantine period skeletal remains from Jordan, and analysis of 3 South American mummies housed in Norway. She teaches courses on the connection between culture and the physical body, as well as general courses in anthropology, archaeology, and physical anthropology. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll pass it over to Anna to get started.
Thank you for that introduction, Amanda, and hello to everybody in attendance. Thank you for being here today. So like Amanda said, I'm a professor in the sociology department, and most of my research areas focus on aging, so at the end of life. So a natural connection to me is also to explore death as well, so the natural end of all of our lives. And I teach the Soc 386 class on our campus, which is a death and dying class. And one thing that I teach my students about each semester I teach this class is the concept of death systems, originally coined by Robert Kastenbaum. And death systems, next slide, please. Death systems are really a way for us to understand death within our own particular society. And one thing I commonly discuss with my students is that in the United States, we often really like to avoid death. We often feel like death is relatively invisible until it touches our own individual lives. And as a society, we don't often grapple publicly with death. Trust me, try bringing up death at a random point in time at a coffee shop in conversation with somebody who's not in a class or willingly engaging in the topic of death. People get really icky about it. They don't want to talk about it. So we would say we have a death avoidant culture here in the United States, but that doesn't mean that nothing about our society touches the idea of death or engages with this idea of death. Next slide, please. So what is a death system? Well, death systems are essentially these complex webs of elements that help us as individuals to mediate our relationship with death within our society. So it helps us make sense of what death is, understand it, feel comfier with it, and also helps us relate to other people on the concept of death. So it helps us understand this thing that, one, makes us super uncomfortable, and two, that we really can't explain. So nobody can really explain what happens after we die, what happens after our loved ones die. So our death systems help us become more integrated with this concept and understand it a bit better. Next, please, Amanda. So what are the key components of the death system? And I'm going to loop this back to the exhibit eventually here. But first, I want to start with talking about people. So there are a lot of people in our society that help us manage and understand our relationship with death. And arguably, we all are people who have a relationship with death in our society, but some people have a stronger connection than others. So in our own particular society, people that we might associate with death who help us understand death and mediate that relationship would be people who seem quite obvious, like funeral directors. So people who help us deal with the end of life, or religious leaders who help us pray and grieve and mourn through the end of life, or morticians and grave diggers. Even people who might not seem quite so obvious, like life insurance agents, are also people who are part of our death system because they help ensure that after we are gone, our families will still be okay. And when I teach my classes, I encourage students to think about who are people who maybe were part of former death systems who no longer exist, or who are people who are part of other cultures' death systems. For instance, plague doctors in the past were a symbol of a person who related to death during times of plague. Those are no longer a part of the people who are a part of our death system now. Next slide, please. There are also some locations in our society that are more connected to death, that remind us of death when we pass them by or when we think about them. And there are some that are more social in meaning. So we all as a society share these meanings. So particular battlefields, for instance, Gettysburg could be one example, or even the World Trade Center site where there's a memorial that if we go there, we all recognize the meaning of these spaces. Even places like graveyards, which I have pictured here, are locations that we tie to death. And I always remind my students, I don't know if you all ever did this when you were kids, but when you would drive by a cemetery or a graveyard, would you ever hold your breath or lift up your feet? Because there are all these traditions we have when we interact with spaces associated with death that help us mediate our relationship with death. So maybe negotiate that fear that we have as a society towards death. I see one, yes. I'm glad I'm not the only one when I was on the school bus where everybody would collectively raise their feet. So that's more of a maybe societal level, or maybe even just our own communities, our own schools, and how we mediate our relationship with death. But these can also be personal. So sometimes places where somebody we love died hold meaning to us, and they might not be recognizable to all other people around us. So these can be quite personal. For instance, if you've ever been driving on the highway and seen road markers for places in our society where people have died, that might not be readily apparent to us. Those markers alert us of that, but that is a more sort of personal location where somebody has experienced death within our society. Next, please. There are certain times also that remind us more of death, that help us negotiate this relationship that we have with death. These can also be a bit social and a bit personal as well. So we have days that we set aside and we reserve in our society to think deeply and reflect on our relationships with death. So times like Memorial Day, Veterans Day, even Halloween, when we dress up and sort of try to poke fun at parts of death like skeletons and ghosts. These are all times that remind us more of our death system and of the inevitability of death. Even days like Dia de los Muertos and other cultures help remind people of death too. And even days when tragic events have happened, like 9/11, become a part of our death system as well. These can also be quite personal. So it might be on a particular day of the year, the anniversary that you lost a loved one, like your mother or a sibling. And this might be recognizable to you, and a day that you hold sacred that perhaps other people in your society don't recognize unless you alert them to that. Next, please. So getting more into some other death system components, there are also objects that remind us of death. So even in our everyday lives, things that we interact with can be symbols of death. One common one is the Grim Reaper, who has persisted as a symbol of death throughout centuries in human society and appears in all different ways, shapes, and forms across many different social periods. Ghosts, coffins, certain types of weapons can also remind us of death. Arguably, too, a lot of the art that is in the exhibit that maybe you have visited or plan to visit are also objects that remind people of death. Maybe they invoke those feelings of understanding and relating to death in you, but maybe they don't. So they can be a bit personal or social in meaning as well. So there are a lot of objects throughout our entire society that on a daily reminder might simply remind us briefly of death and that death exists as inevitable for all of us. Next, please, Amanda. Thank you. And then a final component of our death system I've broken down into two, which are symbols and language. So there are certain symbols of death that help us negotiate our relationships with death and the dying process. So there are all sorts of things like symbols like the color black in the United States, certain animals like crows, especially maybe decades ago when there were movies that came out like Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, that was a very reminiscent of death symbol. Even certain types of music that is played when people have died, such as Amazing Grace, Last Rites, the ceremonial use of flags even can be a symbol of death. If you've ever been on campus and seen the flag at half mast, you might wonder, well, there's the symbol of death. And I wonder who this is meant to relate to, even if you haven't seen any notification of death. These are things that we all understand and that unify us with our recognition of these symbols. And arguably, when I look at a lot of the art that is in the exhibit currently at the art gallery, there's a lot of symbolic nature to the art that is in the gallery that can help remind us all of death. That if we're paying attention and we're looking closely, there are these societal cues that help all of us recognize these feelings of loss and mourning that the artists are exemplifying, such as using funeral flowers in the scissors that Amanda showed you, or using the metal cast of one's family's faces to represent that loss as well. These are symbols that we can all recognize. So when we interact with art, we feel this sense of belonging and unity with this recognition of death within this particular exhibit. Next, please. And then finally, language. So the ways we communicate about death are often unique to our society and our current time period. Some types of language we use to engage with death and to connect with one another over death are things like passed on, or at rest, or asleep, or even rest in peace. These are things that we say to one another to sort of help recognize that death exists and that death has occurred, and help us negotiate that relationship that we have with death. So we all recognize what these phrases mean, and they unify us as members of our society. Next, please. So what are some of the functions of a death system? Why do we have these complex webs of objects and people and places that help us to recognize death and to remember that it exists? And there are actually a lot of functions of death systems. I usually go over about 5 when I teach this class, but one that I think is most important to talk about when we think about the art that is on display at GVSU's gallery is understanding death. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to share one function of a death system with you today. And I think this really is exemplified well by the exhibit on display currently. And by creating objects and symbols that remind us of death, it helps us make sense of death. It helps us make sense of this uncertainty and cruelty and often randomness that invades on each one of our lives. We don't understand why we all die or where we go after we die from a symbolic and spiritual sense. But by producing objects and symbols that help us to engage with death, we can make sense of it a little bit more to help us feel more comfortable with this idea. And there's also this dual purpose that by having this complex web of objects, people, places, things that remind us of death, we relate to one another more effectively. We come together as a society and understanding and recognizing this fear that we all have, and maybe to help abate that fear and discomfort a little bit. And understanding death through our death systems helps us feel like we're a member of our particular society. So arguably all these components of the US death system, including the art that we create around death, help serve a societal purpose of unification and mitigation of fear around something that feels really mysterious to all of us still. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Gwyn, and thank you all for your time.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I thought I would just start with a quick how we kind of process death in anthropology. So we kind of look at it as part of the life cycle. So we're looking at birth and marriage and rites of passage, depending on an individual's culture, and then death also plays into that. We also know that there's not necessarily a universal emotion associated with death. So it depends on what culture you're in. You might see individuals celebrating, they might be angry, and even in some cases, the lack of emotion is expected. And some of the things that we kind of look at a little bit might be color. So Anna showed black. That's one of the colors in our particular culture that's used a lot. White and red are also colors that we see used by different cultures. About 200,000 years ago is when we see like the first use of anything to decorate a burial. And that would be what we call red ochre. So it's a very soft mineral that's crushed up, and it would be placed over the top of the bodies. And you also see some things in Anna's presentation. Wings and skeletons are definitely representations of death. Other things that are not necessarily so important in our culture are sounds. So yes, we have music, but drums or percussive instruments are often an important part of the death rituals. Singing, of course, wailing is sometimes paid for. Dancing as well, but in the Hindu culture, the cracking of the skull on the funeral pyre is a very important stage that shows that that individual has passed. And we also see things such as cutting. So the scissors are very interesting. Because we do see the cutting of clothing, the cutting of hair. We actually see killing of some of the bowls in different cultures, and so on. So I will continue then. Next slide, please. And just kind of go through a couple of the different cultures that I am a little bit more familiar with. So this picture that you see here is Chinchorro. The Chinchorro are from northern Chile, and they date to about 5,000 BC. They're a very interesting culture because they focused on the body really in terms of the ritual component that we can see many years later. And they were a fishing gathering society, so a relatively low level egalitarian, everybody had the same access and expectations. But all individuals appear to have been mummified in this society. And that's something that's sort of unusual that we see everybody treated the same. And so in the picture that you see here on the left, that's sort of the end of the process of the mummification. They actually remove the skin from the individual and dry it. All of the soft tissues are taken away. They kind of rebuild the body using sticks. And then they place dried grasses around the limbs and in the torso area, and then cover that with clay. And then depending on the period when the mummies were created, they might be painted with red or black or both. And sometimes you might find mud mummies as well. And you can see if you look at the face, it's not a particularly recognizable individual, but they are not something that were created and buried in the ground. These were created and then set out for individuals to continue their interaction with over the course of many years. And on the far right side, you can see that there are some little wooden, what we call statuettes. And then the one in the very middle there that actually has some human bone in it. The size of these and the fact that they are wooden sort of suggests that they're for children. And so the hypothesis that we've used in looking at these is that sometimes if you have a miscarriage or if there was a child that died around birth or was stillborn, they still had something to symbolize that individual, even if they didn't necessarily have the bones necessarily to go along or the skin to go along with those. Next slide, please. So this is something that people are a lot more familiar with, but comes actually a couple thousand years later than the chinchorro. So most people associate mummification with the Egyptians, but they actually weren't the first individual culture to use them. So the state level is much different in the Egyptian culture. And I'm talking about these mummies because the grief or the ritual process that we see, the creation of these bodies or the visual portion that you see, that's sort of where they used to focus their grief, is in that typical aspect. So with the mummies that we see from Egypt, we know that they had multiple sarcophagi, and each of those had different images on them. You can see Tutankhamun's death mask there. There were jewels that were placed within the wrapping. Some of them had very specific meanings to them from a religious perspective. And then a number of the very high class, of course, then had the pyramids created for them. And those were something that everybody would notice and everybody would expect to understand what that meant, that these were very high society individuals who had passed. And of course, then it did eventually kind of trickle down, and people who had less status also started doing mummification as well. So next slide. So this is, I kind of put this in here just so you could see the paintings that were also on the walls, and there are a lot of different pieces of furniture that the individual would take forward into the afterlife with them. And so we see religion definitely enfolded into the creation of the mummies, and they had to have specific things to go into the afterlife with them. One interesting thing about the mummies themselves, in the 1800s, when the mummies were sort of being pillaged at the highest point in Egypt, sometimes they were used as firewood because there weren't very many trees around. And so to run the steam engines, they would use them instead of coal. But also they would occasionally be ground up, and sometimes that would be used as medicine. And it was also actually used as a color for paint, and the paint color was just mummy. So that was kind of interesting. Next slide, please. So the Tarajan are from Indonesia, a little bit less well known. And they are very interesting because of the effigies that they have created. Mind you, within the historic period, they changed the way that they buried their dead. They used to put them in boats that were on the ground or in caves that were easy to get to. But there was so much pillaging of the burials that they decided to put them up really high, so it was hard for anyone to reach them. And so they had artists, whether individuals working in stone, that would get up really high and build these caves. And then the bodies would be placed in the caves. And what you see in this picture are the effigies that would be placed out front to represent the individuals that were inside. And these were made out of wood and typically are more often seen in individuals that were of very high status. And the Tarajan are actually very interesting because they keep the dead in their house, sometimes for a year or more, until they have been able to amass the amount of wealth necessary to go through the entire ritual. So it's a very interesting culture. People actually go to visit the Tarajan to see the effigies as well. Next slide, please. So monumental architecture. So we saw the pyramids. We know that the Taj Mahal was created by a husband for his wife because he was feeling a good deal of grief at her death. Next slide. And we see that type of thing sort of around the world. This is an image of the piece of work that was created to celebrate the life of Princess Diana. So this is in England. And it is sort of, as you see, a circular fountain. There's water constantly flowing. There are areas where there's sort of little rocky, spots, and then there are sort of lower spots that are more calm. And the rocky spots were sort of meant to represent the times in her life when she was experiencing more difficulties. And then the smoother parts were actually originally meant for people to kind of splash around in the water and cool off. They had to close that part of it because people were slipping and falling, but that was originally the part of it. And they put that aspect into it because she was called the people's princess. And then in the way that the individuals could splash in the water sort of allowed the population to kind of feel that closeness with her. It's interesting, though, that when this piece came out, there were a lot of people who were very upset. It's beautiful, but it is very low relief. You can't really see it until you get right up on it. And people thought that the memory of her should be something more monumental that could be seen from a distance. And so they kind of thought this was the way that the royal family maybe tried to represent her as not being quite so, high up in people's minds, that they should remember that she isn't really part of the family anymore. So that was something some people got a little bit upset with. And you can go to the next slide. So there have been monumental architecture pieces built for individuals and just their families in some cases to grieve. And then, of course, others have large numbers of individuals grieving for him or them. So this is one of Michelangelo's pieces. And I think a lot of us can understand the idea of the grief of Mary over the loss of Jesus. So this is yet another sort of monumental piece of architecture. Okay. Next, sorry. So then looking at sort of more of a population level, Anna talked about the masks that were worn by doctors during the plague. There are actually a lot of images that come out of the plague. Many of them have the skeleton associated with them. Some of the art, like the white piece in this image, is called Memento Mori. And so there's an entire class of art that's really looking at death and how sort of death comes upon us and into the culture. Next slide, please. And this is just another version of a plague art piece. And I chose this one, and I don't know if you can really see it very well, but at the bottom, there's a baby sort of next to its mother who's no longer there. So it really is encompassing like the very deepest part of grief, I would say, that we can imagine. Next slide. Something we might not be quite as familiar with. This is also in London. I've taken students to London several times. That's why I have a lot of images from there. But this particular piece that you're looking at here was created after the July 2005 bombings in several different locations in London. And so what you see here, actually 52 columns, each column representing one of the individuals that passed during the time of those bombings. And the height is sort of meant to show how much the people thought of those individuals that passed. And it stays there for everybody to remember that happened, which is very much akin to what we see with the 9/11 memorial as well. Next slide, please. So sort of a little bit more personal things that might be created by individuals. On the right, you see a ring. These are things that might have been created during the Victorian period, although they are making a comeback. So in the very center, that is woven hair. And it's very frequent that hair was something that was worked with to create small pieces of art or small remembrances. Some of them, like the ring that you could wear along, or a necklace or something like that. And then on the left, you see that this piece is actually like hair wound around small wires to represent sort of a little garden image, but something that people could look at to remember those that they lost. Next slide. And Anna talked about the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, originally coming from sort of the southwestern United States and into Mexico. This is something that has kind of become a little bit more, I guess, commodified and commercialized in the last few years. But originally, you would have individuals make these display altars. Very often, flowers were included in these images of the loved ones. You would also have offerings left, so food, drink, and that type of thing. In addition to those, though, you would also see sugar skulls, and I'm sure some of you have actually seen those before. Those were sort of meant to be there as the individual being present, and during the Day of the Dead, it's sort of a cultural idea that the dead actually sort of come back, and it's a night that you can spend among the dead, and it's a celebration more than a period of grief. And then the art on the left side is something that we see very often representing the Day of the Dead. Next slide. So this is a large, sort of large scale art, but based on the small scale loss of life. So this is the AIDS quilt, where individual families or groups of people that knew someone put together the quilt, and then they brought all of the quilts together. So they showed that it's not just one family or one community of people grieving over an individual, but many people grieving over the same type of death for those individuals. Next slide, please. These are actually kind of interesting. So these are fantasy coffins that you see that were developed by the Ga in Ghana. And the idea is that they would select something that was sort of associated with the individual and then create a coffin like the cow and the fish and so forth. And fish and birds were more traditionally common, but these have been around for many years. And some say that they were sort of created as a way to sort of put off Christianity, more showing of their traditional values in Africa. Okay, next slide. This is an image from Bali. One of the things that we think about when we're looking at death is sort of the process that the body goes through. We typically bury our individuals as soon as possible. And that takes us through sort of the separation from society when the individual dies, to the time when the majority of the grief happens, and then the body is buried and you're sort of supposed to go back to your life as usual. So it's very short for us. In other cultures, the period of mourning is much longer. So for example, in places like Bali, you might have a body that is kept in a house, or sometimes it might be buried underground, and they wait for the soft tissues to decay where they are no more. Then they would wash the bones and put them into something like you see here. They're floats. The floats are sort of taken through the towns and they're turned around and around and around. And that is to sort of make the spirits that could potentially be malevolent not know which way they were going. And then at the end, the entire float along with the skeletal remains are cremated. And this is very, very expensive. So there might be more than one individual cremated at any time. Next slide. And I thought this was really interesting. We're starting to see a lot of art that is created for people to keep out and to look at, that have the ashes of their loved ones embedded in them. So glass is something that we're seeing, a lot of different types of glass. There's birds, there's angels, like globes, that type of thing. The one in the middle, they're using the ashes to create pieces of art, which made me think, oh, that's interesting, because they used to do that with the mummies. And then the glass ring. There are a number of different types of jewelry that you can get that are glass, but if you have the money, which is about $25,000, you can have a diamond created from your loved one, and you can have that to wear wherever you choose to go. Next slide. And this is a really interesting piece of artwork that is from the American Southwest. That's a very contemporary, the tree sort of representing like the tree of life. And then on this tree, the individual families are given a set of wings, and then they decorate the wings according to their loved one. And then they're putting all of the wings onto the tree. And this is specifically related to COVID. So individuals who have lost loved ones to COVID. So I thought that was really quite interesting. And that's sort of what I brought with me. And you know, if you have any questions, that would be great. And it was nice talking to all of you.
Thanks, Gwen, and thanks, Anna. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now, and we will open it up to questions. And again, you're welcome to drop your questions into the chat, or to use the raise hand function, or to take yourself off mute. Zoom is funny sometimes. It'll let you unmute. Sometimes it won't let you unmute. So feel free. If you have to leave us, thank you for joining. I'll send a follow-up email with information about other upcoming events. And since there's a few of you still here, we do have a workshop, a jewelry making workshop with Renee Zettel-Sterling, one of the artists from the exhibition, coming up March 19th. It's a Saturday. There's just a couple more spots left there. There's a capacity of 16. So definitely check out our website if you're interested in that. It's free. Art gallery staff, did you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question, and this is kind of geared towards what Anna was talking about with the way that we talk about death and kind of our death symbols. I find that people tend to avoid using the word like, he died, and they'll say stuff like he passed on. So I was wondering, do you think we use that kind of language as kind of part of the Western avoidance of death, or just, I guess, more thoughts on that process?
Yeah, I think that is a really good question. It's something I talk about a lot with my students, that some of these types of language we use have been constructed to soften death because it's so difficult for us to confront the reality of somebody's death. And we do it also, I think, out of respect for people who have lost somebody because we want to be sensitive. But of course, these are things that are emblematic of our own socio-historical time period and have not always been a normal way to refer to death, but it's definitely emblematic of our very death avoidant society. And another thing that I talk about with my students as well is that we often use that language too to soften the blow for children too. So we typically don't talk about death and say your pet died, for instance, to a child. We say, well, they're just sleeping now, or they're at rest. And it's often because we don't know if they're ready to handle that.
That's funny you mentioned it like that. I have a 4-year-old, and I was in his preschool classroom on Monday, and the very first thing one of his little classmates said to me was, "My mom died." And I feel like they don't get it until direct words like dead and death and died come into the conversation because they don't understand euphemisms,
Yeah, and some kids will grow up and be confused too because their parents had always said that death was at rest or at sleep or something like that, and then it sort of complicates their relationship with death when they become adults, which kind of bleeds into the area of psychology and at what age stages children can understand the finality of death.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I have a son too, and my father passed away a few years ago. And, we'll say, well, grandpa went to heaven, and we know he doesn't understand because he'll occasionally say, well, when is he coming back? And it's hard for us to explain, well, he died and he's not going to be coming back. So yeah, it can take kids quite a while to understand that.
Yeah. And oftentimes I think it's harder for parents to have that conversation than kids because they don't have all of the emotional connections and the sense of time, how long time is. Yeah. Go ahead, Courtney.
I have a question. So, and this may be more for Gwen, are other cultures better at having open representations of people mourning? I feel like in our culture, especially here in the United States, if we lose a loved one, whether it's a spouse, a child, a parent, we don't have a symbol or a sign that says, hey, I'm grieving, I'm going through a really hard time. There's no way for people to know that. And I in my head and stuff that I've read, I feel like way back hundreds of years ago, maybe in this country, we had, whether it was the black armband or the black, I don't feel like we have that in our culture today. And I think it forms a sort of a disconnect with people and in how we interact with others. I'm curious if there's other cultures that are better at doing that than we are.
Yeah, so one example, like in India, among the Hindu, they will, at least the males, shave their heads upon the death of their father, for example, and then they wear white during the entire mourning period. There are cultures that tear or cut their clothes and then wear them backwards for a while as well to indicate that type of thing. So we are very, very different, I would say, in the way that we express death. It's almost, like Anna was talking about, we're afraid to talk about it because if you don't talk about it, then it's maybe not really there.
Has the United States always been a death avoided culture? Have we always suppressed that? No.
Anna can answer this too, but wakes used to be held in the homes, and it was very common, and death was understood being so close. But after they sort of came out of the home, that's when I think anyway they started really distant. We became distant from that idea of death.
Yeah, I would echo that it hasn't always been this way. And we can look towards other funeral rituals too. Like in Victorian times, people would get portraits taken, like pictures taken with their dead relatives as a way to remember them. And today, if you tell that to anybody, that are like, oh gosh, like why would people do that? And there wasn't this fear around bodies or death. And I think there are a lot of reasons why we're more death avoidant. One main one is we simply have less interaction with death on a day-to-day basis because we don't talk about it with each other. We don't care for the dead bodies of our loved ones the way that we used to and the way that so many societies still do. So we've become really divorced from the entire process. And there are other reasons too, but I think that's some of the main changes that have happened.
Thanks. I was wondering about that. I also want to mention a couple of things. Renee Zettel-Sterling, one of the artists in the exhibition, when we first started talking way back before the exhibition was installed, she talked a lot about the death positive movement and the fact that there are pockets around the United States of communities who are talking more positively about death and embracing their own death experiences and that of loved ones. At our next talk on loss and healing, we'll actually have someone who's a trained death doula talking about that support system. That's kind of a new addition to the end of life care process. And then I see that our curator, Joel, took himself off of or on, he's on video now. So I'll actually maybe pass it to him to mention some of the objects that we have outside of the gallery. That's the other thing that I was going to mention. Joel, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, when people were discussing that too, I was thinking about we have some historic photography that's outside the gallery, along with some jewelry, some hair jewelry. There's a really beautiful wristband bracelet and a watch fob, as well as a locket with 4 different types of hair in it. So there's a few things that if you stop by the gallery, outside the gallery, we have a couple of cases. But photography in particular, I think, was one of the things. It was this. I think that when it first came out, it enabled a lot of people to preserve. There was a fascination with the ability for that to preserve that experience or that person. So you have photographs of people in coffins. You have photographs of the event too. So yeah, I think some of those objects kind of fascinate me. I think there's been a little bit of if I'm not correct, there's been a move away from that in terms of photographing people and those events. And I also think back to my experiences going to funerals, just the trouble talking with people. I think that was that's a challenge. And I think that's a reflection of contemporary society here is I don't know what to say. And I almost wish that I was more enabled to be able to talk more freely about it and not have to worry, right? If you were to bring up a conversation about death outside of that situation, like at a coffee shop, like you were saying, and can you have a conversation with somebody about death without it becoming too taboo or awkward?
Yeah,
that actually did happen to me one time too. And actually going back to Gwyn, your presentation and talking about the Torajan people of Indonesia, I talk about death rituals related to the Torajan people in my class as well, just to sort of put their death system at odds with our own. And I found ground coffee at a coffee shop from the Torajan region of Indonesia. So I was like going up and buying, and I was super excited. And I started talking to the cashier. I was like, like the Torajan people have some of the most interesting death rituals in the world. And this person is just like, okay, can you please leave now? And I had forgotten that it was weird to talk about death with other people. So that did actually happen to me. They weren't feeling it.
Oh, that's too funny. Yeah, we've been immersed in this exhibition for months now, and it's become more natural to talk about death and dying. So I could go on about this. I find this a really interesting topic, but I'm gonna close it out unless anyone else has any other questions or comments, any other directions you were hoping to take this conversation.
Emma just asked in the chat that how we can access the YouTube video if we would like to watch the recording later on.
Since you were here, I think I have your contact info. Emma, if you could just put your email address into the chat here, you can send it privately to me. If you RSVP'd, I have your email address, but if you didn't, just send it to me just to be safe. And I will send the YouTube link out to everyone, and then it'll be publicly accessible on YouTube. So if you're just searching our YouTube channel by most recent video, it'll be there. I'm also going to send you all a survey because we all live and die by surveys around here. If you could fill that out, it takes 3 minutes. It's very simple. I just want to know what you thought, how you heard about this, and then there will be a mention of our next Unpacking the Exhibition conversation at the end. Gotcha. Thanks, Emma.
And I did drop the link to the survey in the chat already if you want to get ahead of the game and do it before you get the emails, so you don't forget.
Thank you. All right, any other questions, comments? All right, thank you to Gwyn and Anna. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. You all should sign up for Gwyn and Anna's classes. Thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm jumping off.